Come at me, Gen Z. Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Kristen. Today I'm going to be talking about why I was so disappointed in the novella, How the King of Elfhame Learned to Hate Stories by Holly Black. This is a novella that is set before, during, and after the Folk of the Air series by Holly Black, which is The Cruel Prince, The Wicked King, and The Queen of Nothing. You will note that I actually bought a copy of this novella. While I will say it was worth it for the illustrations, I was pretty let down about the actual content of the novella itself. For those who don't know, The Folk of the Air is a young adult fantasy series following the main character, Jude, who is a teenage human girl who, when she was 7, was taken along with her sisters to live and grow up in Fairy. I read this series for the first time last year and absolutely fell in love with it. You can imagine then that I was so thrilled to find out that Holly Black was releasing a novella from Cardan's perspective. So what I'm going to talk about today is how this novella was described before it was published, what my expectations were based on my personal feelings and hopes and dreams, and then what we actually got in this novella. I will try to keep it as non-spoilery as possible, other than to say, like, Jude and Cardan get together by the end of the series. Shocker, you know? So that is sort of a given. I'll talk about that, but I will have a very specific spoilery section towards the end that I'll give lots of notice for, because I want to pitch my ideas from scenes or potential scenes that could have been done from the series that were not included in this novella. So how was this book actually, or this novella actually described? I'll read sort of the part of the description that was released on the publication site as well as on Goodreads. So it said, you know, his tale includes delicious details of life before The Cruel Prince, the first book, an adventure beyond The Queen of Nothing, the last book in the series, and familiar moments from the Folk of the Air trilogy told wholly from Cardan's perspective. And that is sort of technically what we do get. However, for whatever reason, we're going to shift into expectations now. For whatever reason, I was not necessarily expecting this novella to be sort of a story on its own. I thought that it was instead going to be a collection of scenes. Scenes in the writing style of the the Folk of the Air. I also was, based on that description, expecting specific scenes from the series itself. Cardan's depiction in the first book is pretty awful. In fact, the first scene that we ever get with Cardan is him literally ripping the wings off of a fairy. And of course, Jude in this moment is like, oh, he's the worst. And the reader, I in that moment was like, yeah, he is the worst. There's no way that that is going to be the love interest. We do actually, throughout the series, get snippets into the reality of Cardan's upbringing and how that and the way that he was treated as a child contributes to why he was the way that he was and why he chose to be the way that he was. But I was really expecting this novella to provide further insight into Cardan and Cardan's trauma. Although you don't want to say, like, yes, I really wanted to see Cardan being abused as a child. It's not exactly that, but I was ready to go there with Cardan. So what did we actually get in this novella? First, I will say that this is an illustrated novella, and it was illustrated so beautifully. The artist, Ravina Kai, did an amazing job, so I'll talk more about the illustration towards the end of this video. This novella does technically share moments from Cardan's life before, during, and after the series. There is also a story within the story. There is a story about a prince that is retold to Cardan 3 times over the course of this book, and I did not find that necessary. I think that it took up way more page time than was needed in a very short novella. I don't feel like it added anything in particular to my understanding of Cardan as a character, and it was not, while it was like, it wasn't super boring, but it wasn't super interesting either to reread basically the same story 3 times. These scenes that are written sort of pre-series spends a lot of time on his relationship with Nicasia, which, I don't know, maybe you were really interested in. I was not particularly, or I didn't feel the urge to see the ins and outs of how Cardan and Nicasia came to be and how they came to break apart, which you do get. Now I'll talk about what we actually got in terms of when the description mentioned we were going to get familiar scenes from the series. I guess whether or not this is true is how you describe familiar and how you describe scenes, plural. We technically only got 1 scene, singular, from the trilogy. And that was, this is not spoilery, it is from the first book when Cardan is still bullying Jude, and it is the scene in the river. So that we get a teensy little bit from Cardan's perspective. And I found it quite disappointing in the sense that it did not give me insight into what was really going on in Cardan's head. I'm glad that we didn't get like a word for word back and forth of the dialogue again. We do get to see how that scene came about beforehand, and what sort of led Cardan to that. There are 2 other scenes that I guess could be familiar, but they didn't actually happen during the trilogy. There's this one time when Jude is describing how horrible Cardan is, and she thinks about a time that Cardan was so drunk he rode a horse through the middle of their class. So that didn't technically take place during the trilogy, but Jude mentions it during the trilogy, and so that is a scene that we get. We get to see sort of how that came to be, and then Cardan's perspective while he's drunkenly riding this horse through the middle of his class. The other scene that we get is in the 3rd book. This is not really spoilery. Nicasia tells Jude that Cardan had been helping human servants in Baelkin's household to escape. And so we do get to see a short scene of Cardan helping one of the human servants escape back to the human world. Overall, I would say that is probably where I am the most disappointed. And then finally, in terms of sort of the what we get afterwards, honestly, just like I was really hoping to get a lot of Jude and Cardan together in this little adventure. And while we do get an adventure from their life afterwards, it is very, very Cardan focused, which is fair. This is Cardan's novella after all, but they're not actually just like together a lot of it. It's sort of, there are brief moments where they're together, and we do get cute sort of inner thoughts of Cardan directed towards Jude, and we get a little bit of their interactions, and we do get to see how Cardan views Jude a little bit. Hey, editing Kristen here. So I think that the point I was trying to ineffectively make was that I thought we were going to be able to finally see Jude and Cardan working together really well and having the story be written in a style very similar to the series itself. And that isn't what took place. It was more Cardan being really introspective the whole time, although Jude is around, and him operating on this adventure sort of on his own and not together with Jude. Okay, so now I am going to switch into the more spoilery section. This is not necessarily spoils for what happens within this. I won't say anything more about that, but this is spoilery in terms of the trilogy. So if you haven't read the trilogy, skip ahead to the timestamp that I will post here. But I'm going to share now the scenes or moments in time from the trilogy that I think would have been better than what we actually got, that would not have been direct repeats from the trilogy. So this was off the top of my head when I sort of conceived of the idea for this video a few days ago. First things first, the explanation of the dress, the ball gown from the first book. That is never addressed. Jude and Cardan never talk about it, it's never acknowledged, no reason. So that could have been something, like how did Cardan come to purchase this dress for her? Next up, any point at time during the 2 months that she is in the undersea. Nothing. 2 months worth of time when Jude goes from being his like controller to suddenly being missing, and we know that he takes a huge hit like politically in order to get her back. So like, let's see that conflicting moment. Let's see the internal turmoil of his feelings about Jude, or him working to get her back. Snake perspective? I don't necessarily feel like I needed that, but it could have been something. That could have been cool. What's next? When he's been poisoned, so like when Jude is off with Balkan and he's been poisoned, we could have seen some of that. Or when he mistakes Taryn for Jude when she comes in while he's been poisoned. Or during this time period, like how did he get to this to then him proposing to Jude like hours later? Like what was going on in his head? How did that come to be? I would have loved to see that. After, in the third book, when Jude like comes back and is pretending to be Taryn, and then she gets like rescued by Maddox, we know that Cardan really fought and to get Jude back. So like that would have been cool when Jude is being like kidnapped by Maddox in Cardan's perspective. Like how did Cardan respond in that moment? How was he acting? What was he thinking? Or we also know that he like freaked out, went to the human world, to Vivi's apartment. So like, again, these are scenes that would have been amazing to see through Cardan's eyes and what he was thinking. I think I only have one more. Yes, okay, so the final one that I thought off the top of my head was after Jude is back again and she's like, after she's like been stabbed by Maddox and she like falls from the roof of the burrow or however you say that. And the next morning that, I forget his name, but that asshole counselor tries to like come in and have a meeting with her after she's like been injured, and he like tries to spring this meeting on her and yell at her, and then Cardan comes in and he takes that guy into the other room. Like that would have been cool to see. I want to see Cardan standing up for Jude. What did he say to that asshole? Anyway, those are it. That's it. Just off the top of my head, those are moments in time that would not be direct repeats of scenes, but that I think either would have been helpful in showing us Cardan's perspective, the development of their relationship from Cardan's eyes, the inner turmoil of him like sort of hating or not wanting to be into Jude but being into Jude, because we get that from Jude's perspective. Why can't we get it from Cardan's? Okay, so welcome back to those people who skipped ahead. Now I'm going to talk about the illustrations. This novella was illustrated. The intent was to be illustrated from the whole time. So Holly Black did write this knowing that it was going to be illustrated. I think Ravina Kai did such an amazing job of these illustrations. The art is very ethereal and woodsy and beautiful. It is probably, out of all of the sort of Jordan fan art that I have seen, this is perhaps some of my favorite like top depictions of Cardan and his aesthetic. I think that the illustrations perhaps make me not regret to some extent purchasing this physical copy. I think that if you are reading this novella, it is worth reading a physical copy so that you can see the illustrations while it's happening. I don't think that it would come across the same as an ebook. The only other ebook that I have read that was an illustrated novella was The Sleeper and the Spindle by Neil Gaiman. I read that last year, and let me tell you, the illustrations did not come across well in conjunction with the writing when I was reading it as an ebook on my phone. So I do think that it is worth, if you are going to read this novella, I think that it is worth reading it as a physical hard copy. Whether or not you purchase that, get it from the library, or borrow it from a friend is up to you. That is my sort of, I don't know, rant-ish explanation of why I was pretty disappointed by the novella. I will admit that when I was re-skimming through it again the other morning to prepare for this video, my opinion has softened a little bit, I would say, because I now had different expectations on this sort of like reread. I do acknowledge that my very specific expectations impacted how I perceived this book. So I think moving forward, I have a softer and better impression of what this novella does provide. Anyway, that is it for me today. Let me know down below if you have read this novella. What were your thoughts? Were your expectations in line with what you got? Were you satisfied as a whole on what the novella provided and included? Or were you like me and perhaps a little bit let down? Don't forget to like and subscribe. Hitting the little bell will get you notifications for when I post new videos. I typically post on Sundays and Wednesdays. Have a great day, everyone. We'll see you next time. Bye.